Hello, boils and ghouls.
Ladies and gentlemen, how do you do? This is Black Sabbath.
So this is a new series I want to start here. Kind of like a mini rundown, little dive into certain directors that I think are some of the greatest directors in horror. So for the first episode here, the only one I can think of starting with is the legendary Mario Bava. Let's briefly dive into the great career of the Italian horror maestro, Mario Bava, and then I will go into my personal top 10 Mario Bava films. I don't want to get too deep into it, because I want this to kind of be maybe an introduction for people who are horror fans who maybe have never heard of Mario Bava, never got into Italian horror, or just maybe saw a film or two by him or heard of them and never actually checked him out. So I don't want to give spoilers for the plots. You will see clips throughout all of this like you're seeing now, but none of it really gives too much of spoilers for the plots of the movies. Mario Bava was born in Sanremo, Italy in 1914, and he got into the world of filmmaking pretty much immediately at a young age. His father, Eugenio Bava, was a respected cinematographer in Italy and also did some special effects. So Mario ended up going into his father's business and learning all the tricks of the trade for film, and he became a cinematographer. He was amazing behind the camera, and he also picked up on special effects work. Now, why Mario Bava is such an important director to me and for many in just cinema history in general, but especially horror. He's been called the master of the macabre, the master of Italian horror, the Italian horror maestro. It goes on, is the fact that he did start as a cinematographer. The way that Mario Bava's films are framed and lit, and for his colored movies, the color usage, just every scene is framed like a painting, pretty much. All of his films for me are like different moving paintings, or if you're a Rush fan, like moving pictures. I think it's pretty safe to say that a lot of those aspects of Bava's films, how stylish they are, even the black and white films, The Black Sunday and The Girl Who Knew Too Much or The Evil Eye, the use of the black and white is just gorgeous compared to other black and white films of the time. So this man just knew how to capture exactly what he wanted to through a camera lens, and that led him into directing. He started his career in the late 30s as like a camera assistant or a title designer, different little jobs here and there of him, learning under his father. So just to keep this a little brief, I'm gonna basically stick to Mario Bava's major horror films. He's made many other films, spaghetti westerns. There's been some that I've seen, Eric the Conqueror, Hercules, Danger Diabolique is a pretty interesting one. It's almost like a live-action comic, but outside of those few films I just mentioned, and I don't even remember them too well, they were one-time watches. So I'm just going to stick to his horror films. But this man started so many genres themselves, or just influenced horror cinema especially, but just film in general, in such ways that you could still see his influence today. Like, this guy has been praised by Martin Scorsese. Quentin Tarantino has Black Sabbath in his top 3 films of all time. Francis Ford Coppola, like, you can go down the list of legendary directors that have all been directly inspired by Mario Bava's films. He pretty much single-handedly created the giallo, film genre in Italy. Some will cite Blood and Black Lace from '64 as the first giallo, but I kind of feel The Girl Who Knew Too Much, which is a few years prior to that from him, but there's no denying that he pretty much created the giallo film genre. Kill Baby Kill from 1966 is my favorite ghost story of all time. And there is a lot of elements in Kill Baby Kill that directly inspired a lot of Japanese horror and Asian horror with ghost jump scares and the way that they're shot. Then in 1971, he put out his film, A Bay of Blood, or what I prefer and wish that this was the title everywhere for this movie because it's the greatest name for a film ever, Twitch of the Death Nerve. And this film, in my opinion, is the first true slasher film. This is the film that shaped and molded what would become the slasher craze of the 80s. Even if John Carpenter with Halloween, or Bob Clark with Black Christmas, Tobe Hooper with Texas Chainsaw Massacre, even if they didn't see Twitch of the Death Nerve back then, the influence was still there because no one was doing the stuff that he did in Twitch in horror or in any type of films. Just brutal kills, which Friday the 13th Part 2, I've said this many times and everyone knows this, who's a Bava fan especially, rips off two of the kills in this movie, one of them fucking verbatim, exactly, shot for shot almost. Now, I could see people counter-arguing this and, throwing out other films to cite as earlier slashers or ones that had just as much importance, of course. But especially the fact that Friday the 13th, after seeing the success of Halloween in 78, is the film that basically really started the slasher genre in the 80s and the whole slasher craze. The fact that Twitch of the Death Nerve had such an influence on Friday the 13th. We wouldn't have a Friday the 13th franchise if it wasn't for Mario Bava. Let's get that right out of the way now. And without Friday the 13th, we probably wouldn't have had, to the extent that it was, the craze with the slasher films and the thousands of slasher films that were being made in the early to mid 80s. His 1965 sci-fi film, Planet of the Vampires, has been cited as a direct influence on Ridley Scott's Alien, almost being considered like a spiritual predecessor, because there's a lot of similar elements in like the style of the film and how it's shot, the way it looks, and with some elements of the premise too. So I mean, these are just a few examples of the huge impact that Mario Bava has had on cinema throughout his entire career, creating basically two subgenres of horror that we hold dearly today. And we have thousands of films in each of those subgenres, and just pushing the limit stylistically and lighting and the color usage, and just knowing how to make a shot of death look gorgeous, which is something that directly inspired Dario Argento, and he has said this in interviews. You can list pretty much every major Italian horror filmmaker of the 70s and 80s, and they are absolutely directly inspired by Mario Bava in some way. Dario Argento, Lucio Fulci, Bruno Mattei, Claudio Fragasso, Sergio Martino even, and he really got into the giallos and was one of the best giallo filmmakers there was. But you see Bava influences throughout his films too. Umberto Lenzi, Ruggero Deodato, it goes on and on, you list any of them. So now, I'm gonna hop into my top 10 Mario Bava films. Now, before I start the top 10, I was thinking of doing honorable mentions, but honestly, and I say this all the time, of all the films that I've seen from Mario Bava, all his horror films and the aforementioned, other genre films, he's never made a bad film. I've never seen a movie by Mario Bava that I didn't like, to love, to it's a masterpiece. He's never made a bad film. So, all the films that aren't on this top 10 are basically the honorable mentions of his horror catalog. I mean, The Girl Who Knew Too Much from '63, the great John Saxon in an early role.
I don't know what you're trying to do, but I know that you're involved in this. Perhaps Nora has seen the killer. But how do we know that he hasn't seen her?
And he does great in it. I forget who, I don't remember any of the actresses really, or actors in most Italian horror. There's a few, there's some icons, one particularly that we'll get to. But she's great in that too, and like I said, I pretty much consider that to be the first Giallo film. It's his last film that was in black and white. It was a conscious decision to make it black and white because he was making colored films prior to that. Planet of the Vampires, I talked about a little bit earlier. Check it out if you haven't seen it. Especially if you're a sci-fi fan, which I'm not really. I'm not a big sci-fi fan, some of you know that. And especially if you're a fan of Alien. Like in Prometheus, it had inspiration on also. Yeah, it's hokey. It's a 60s sci-fi film. But it has so much style to it. Barren Blood from '72. This might be one of my least favorite Bava films. It might be my least favorite. Now that I'm really going through it. Don't get me wrong, it's good. There's some good kills in it. It kind of feels like not a reboot, but like a reimagining in a way of Black Sunday. Just like a colorized, more brutal version. But it just doesn't grasp me in the ways that other Bava films do. So I think it's one of his weakest films. Still a good movie. I still throw it on now and then. It's gorgeous looking, like every Bava film. Like, all the lighting is great. The gothic atmosphere and feeling and tone to the movie, all of that's excellent. So it's definitely worth a watch if you haven't seen that Bava movie. And then this one I will mention, even though it's not really a horror film and it has a very weird backstory, but I have not seen Rabid Dogs to this day yet. It was a film that Bava was working on and pretty much almost finished in, I believe, 73, 74, it was in the mid-70s, early 70s. And it didn't get released until the late 90s. So I never got a chance to see it. It's definitely on my list, so I can't comment on that one. But I hear nothing but great things. And I actually see it pretty high up on some people's Bava favorite movie lists. So definitely something I need to check out soon. So let's start off with number 10. So my number 10 is $5 for an August Moon from 1970. Now, for people who are listening who aren't big into Italian horror or just getting into it, all of these movies, all of them, have like a dozen names. They have so many alternate titles. It was a distribution thing and just trying to get the movie back into theaters multiple times and releasing it overseas. So all these films have so many different titles. If I know them offhand, I'll name it. But you might have seen or probably heard of some of these, but maybe under a different name. But $5 for an August Moon, it's an interesting one from Bava. It kind of feels like a template for his next film, Twitter the Death Nerve or Bad Blood. This movie had a very troubled production. Bava was not the original director. The guy died, I think, like a few days before this movie was set to, start production. And Bava ended up taking over, which is something he did early on in his career and throughout it. He used to finish a lot of movies that directors weren't able to finish for whatever reason. And he would go uncredited sometimes early in his career for basically making a movie get finished. So he didn't care for the script of this movie, and that's one place where this movie is not the best. It's very convoluted. I mean, a lot of giallos are very convoluted. The reason it makes the list for me is I just love the look of this movie. I love the color usage, I love the lighting, and of course this is things that I love in all Bava films. But remember earlier when I was saying a lot of his films feel like moving paintings? This is, I think, a great example of that. This is one of his films that I feel is most like that. I love the look of the house that they're staying at. Actually, Bava was also an artist. and he ended up painting. There's a beautiful mural, whatever, on the side of the house, and Bava painted it. So that just adds to the beauty of this movie too. It's a beautiful film, I guess is the point I'm trying to make. It has some good kills, nowhere near the great ones that we'll get, the next year with Twitch of the Death Nerve, but they hold up. So number 10, $5 for an August Moon. Number 9 might shock some people, but it's 1977 Shock. It's Mario Bava's final film before he passed away. And a lot of the reason I love this movie is because of Daria Nicolodi. Dario Argento's, previous wife and collaborator. I've always loved Daria. She is so underrated as a scream queen in horror, and just her contribution to horror in general. So just seeing Daria Nicolodi always puts a smile on my face. And I like the plot to this. She ends up moving into her dead husband's house with her son. And then some paranormal shit starts happening. There's some tense scenes. There's some creepy atmosphere in this movie. This movie gets a lot of shit. I don't know if it's just because it's Bava's last film and people like to dog on directors' last movies, because, most of the time they're not the best among their filmography. But I always have a great time watching Shock. So if you haven't seen Shock and you're a Bava fan, definitely check it out, even if you haven't heard great things about it. Number 8 is another unique Bava film, and it's another one of those movies, kind of like $5 for an August Moon, where it's just gorgeous imagery through all of it, and that's a big selling point of this movie for me. We have Christopher Lee in this movie, and he does great as always. The plot, as usual, is convoluted as shit. He moves into this castle that his father was the count, and he was engaged, but he had an affair with the servant, and his father disowned him, and then he returns to the castle, and some paranormal stuff in here. This movie, though, really pushed some limits for 63, with some, S&M stuff in here. So the way that Bava fuses together the eroticism and the taboo, as well as the visual imagery, the lighting, makes this just such a gorgeous movie to watch. And it's always just a visually stunning experience watching this film. Now, I'm not a big Hammer film fan, but a lot of Bava, even when he started with Black Sunday, was kind of emulating the Hammer films from the 50s. But this film has a very Hammer feel to it. So if you're not a big Bava fan or never got big into him, but you love Hammer films, check this out just for the aesthetic alone. Also, side note on Whipping the Body. If you haven't seen it, you plan on checking it out, don't watch the 70-something minute cut called Night of the Phantom. It's something weird. It's not Night of the Phantom. It's a weird title. Don't watch that one, the English dub one. Make sure it's the original Italian release. Now, lucky number 7 might be a shock to some people too, that this is just number 7 on this list. But this film's a masterpiece. Blood and Black Lace, I think, is where Bava perfected the giallo format and the whole formula for giallo films. Despite The Girl Who Knew Too Much coming first, this is where he really upped, especially the brutality and what was acceptable, or what he was putting on screen and forcing people to accept on screen in film. Some of the kills in this movie, with the woman getting drowned in the bathtub, is iconic, and a lot of directors cite that as a big influence, especially Argento. The whole visual aspect of this film is stunning. Short synopsis: it takes place in a fashion house in Rome, and there is a killer who's killing all the fashion models, and great look of the killer with the not a top hat, but like that black rimmed hat, and looks like the pantyhose almost like over his face, but it's thicker than that. The whole look of him is marvel in every way, and it's an essential watch for anyone who's remotely a horror fan. So Blood and Black Lace at number 7 out of 10 on my list, Mario Bava's top 10. Number 6. This is another example of a genre of film that he didn't start in any way, no, but this is one of the greatest anthology films of all time, and that is 1963's Black Sabbath.
Come closer, please. I've something to tell you.
We have Boris Karloff. That's all you need to hear to get you even a little interested. We have 3 stories here. Now, I feel like this suffers a little for some people, not for me as much, but I can see where they're coming from, of trilogy of terror syndrome. And what I mean by that is how the classic anthology from the 70s, Trilogy of Terror with Karen Black, most people, and rightfully so, they're not that great, don't even remember the first 2 segments. It's all about the 3rd segment with the Zuni doll. And the order of the segments in this film, Black Sabbath, are reordered depending on release. You know, the original Italian version, I think, had a drop of water first. And in the American release, it's the telephone. I could be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure that's it. But we have 3 segments. The telephone, which showed more early giallo aspects in Bava's films, where we have this woman who's receiving these threatening phone calls, and there's a good amount of suspense in this. The 2nd segment, the Warlock, very, very gothic atmosphere. Like, this is another thing Bava excels at, and we'll get to the film that I think is his masterpiece with everything, but especially his gothic atmosphere and the tone and the feel of this. And again, very Hammer-like, with the smoke and fog everywhere on a dark night. Like, it feels like you're just a classic horror film. And this is Quentin Tarantino's top 3 movies of all time. He said it many times, that this film, I think it's Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein and The Good, Bad, and the Ugly, are his 3 favorite films and most influential on him as a filmmaker. And then we have The Drop of Water, which is probably the scariest dead corpse in a movie ever. So the face on this dead corpse is so terrifying. It used to give me nightmares when I saw this when I was young. They used to play this movie on TV a lot. Oh, I hated seeing this person's face. And even though it could be jarring and hokey looking, to me it's more effective and creepy that the prosthetics on her face, I think an actress played her in some shots, and other shots it was a dummy. But because of that, it makes it more surreal, and it makes it look even more weird and just eerie. Excellent segment, excellent anthology, one of the best. So Black Sabbath. We wouldn't have Ozzy Osbourne and his prior band Black Sabbath if it wasn't for this movie. They named their band and first album and that song because of this film. Now, number 5. This may be another controversial pick among fellow Bava fans. Hatchet for the Honeymoon from 1970. I love this film. I love that this is more of a character study. I don't want to give too much away for this film and for people who want to check it out, but you know who the killer is this entire time. It's like in the vein of Maniac and like that type of character study. Basically, this guy who suffered a trauma in his childhood feels this urge to kill like brides. The effects look great in this movie. The kills are great. This movie also had a very troubled production. They ran out of money at some point. They cast some woman and wrote a whole subplot just because of her, so it doesn't make a lot of sense, but it doesn't matter. The main focus on John's character is just what makes this movie very different from other giallos and basically every other movie in Bava's filmography. So number 5, if you like character studies on homicidal maniacs, check out Hatchet for the Honeymoon from 1970. Number 4, in 1960, we were given three of what I consider the most influential horror films ever made from 1960 going forward. And probably of all time. I mean, discounting, early films, silent era movies, Dr. Caligari, Frankenstein, the Universal Monsters, of course. But for modern horror, we had Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. We had Michael Powell's Peeping Tom. And we had Mario Bava's Black Sunday. Now, despite Peeping Tom being a classic and Michael Powell being a hugely influential director, it's not a film that I hold dear to me or that I have so much love for that a lot of people do. I recognize it as a classic. I recognize it for what it did for cinema. But it's not a film I watch often. But Psycho and Black Sunday, in my opinion, are the two most important horror films ever made. And they were released a week apart. Psycho got immediate praise. Black Sunday didn't really get great reception, like pretty much most of Bava's films, and a lot of Italian horror throughout history. And then when people come around decades later and look back on it, they realize them for the masterpieces that they are. And this movie is just that. It is a masterpiece. This is the film that made Barbara Steele a horror icon, but the cinematography in this movie is unreal. The black and white in this movie, this is one of the most beautiful looking films shot in black and white that I've ever seen. This is one of the greatest gothic horror films in existence. The gothic atmosphere and the tone of this movie is unmatched. I don't want to say too much. I still have to do a video on this one, as well as a few other Bava films on this list. I've done a few. Check out the Bava playlist. Black Sunday at number 4, masterpiece. Number 3 is 1971's Twitch of the Death Nerve, A Bay of Blood, carnage. It goes on and on. This is, again, for me, the film that started what would be the slasher film. The kills in this movie are excellent. Excellent. The effects look so good in this. The plot, again, convoluted as shit. I've seen this movie so many times, I still don't know fully what's going on. There's this bay that this countess owns, and she ends up being murdered in the very beginning of the movie. Then her husband, in a nice little twist, gets murdered by somebody else. Everyone's a fucking murderer in this movie. I mean, that's a little bit of a spoiler, but not too much. And then basically everybody is trying to compete for ownership of this bay. And a lot of blood is shed. The name Twitch of the Death Nerve is the greatest name for a movie. Unless another movie comes around with an unbelievably imaginative name, then I don't think it's ever going to be topped. This movie was infamously ripped off in Friday the 13th Part 2. Both with Mark's death in the wheelchair when he gets hit by Jason in the face with the machete. It's not identical to the kill here, but it's so close looking. But the one that's shot for shot almost is the spear through the couple fucking in the bed. Identical to Sandra and Jeff in Friday. Now, I know Victor Miller has said that he hasn't seen the film, or was it Steve Miner, or maybe the both of them, said and denied that they saw the movie. Sorry, I don't believe them. They are fucking lying about that. Sorry, there is no way that they shot that scene in Friday Part 2 and it just came out exactly like this film that came out 10 years earlier. So if you're a slasher fan and you haven't gotten to Bava, you haven't seen Twitch of the Death Nerve, A Bay of Blood, absolutely check it out if you want to see where the slasher genre pretty much was born. Number 2 is Lisa and the Devil from 1973. This, I feel, is such an underrated Bava movie, even among people who adore Bava. We have Elka Samar in here. I remember her name because I love her performance in this. And I always forget the guy's name, man, who plays the quote-unquote devil because I don't want to give away too much. This movie is a complete head trip. It's so surreal. Again, it's visually just stunning. It gets a little psycho near the end, a little bit, but there's a lot of great creepy imagery throughout this movie too. I just love everything about this film, and this is a top 10 movie for me. All the top 4 films here on this list are in my top 40 films of all time. I did a video on my top 40 films. Mario Bava has the most films on my top 40 list. So he is the director with the most films in my top films of all time. And this one, as well as number 1, are in the top 10. Number 1. Now I'm sure some of you, either 1, who know me, might know this, or 2, deduced from everything else, is 1966 Kill Baby Kill. This is Mario Bava's absolute masterpiece. For me. And for many. I still feel like it's underrated. Everything about this film is just masterfully handled, crafted, written, the lighting, every scene, the sets, just the gothic feel. And this is the film I was referring to that I think he does it the best. This is his best gothic horror film. This is the greatest ghost horror film of all time for me. The ghost of Melissa Graps in this film, something about it, something about the look of this kid. And Mario Bava went through hundreds of girls for the role of Melissa Graps, for this ghost girl. He didn't like any of them. He ended up using just some little Italian boy and threw a blonde wig on him. Put like a little bit of like pale makeup, I guess. That's it. That's all the design of this ghost. And I think it's the most creepy, effective, scary ass, little ass girl ghost that I've ever seen in a movie. This directly inspired The Changeling with the bouncing ball. If you've ever seen a bouncing ball related to a ghost in a movie, thank Mario Bava. Martin Scorsese has stated this as Mario Bava's masterpiece. All the shots of the spiral staircase in La Villa Graps, I love the shots of that spiral staircase. The color usage in this movie is phenomenal. One of the best in film history for me. That's how high regard I hold this movie. If you haven't seen Kill Baby Kill, or any of the movies on this list, if you haven't gotten into Mario Bava, for some reason you haven't heard of Mario Bava, check out some of the top ones on this list. I'm sure you'll enjoy at least some elements of all of them, if you're a horror fan. Mario Bava unfortunately passed away from a heart attack, a sudden one, 1980, but his legacy as a filmmaker, as a cinematographer, as a screenwriter, as a special effects artist, everything the man did has lived on and will live on forever in cinema history. This has been a director dive on the Italian maestro of horror, Mario Bava. Hope everyone has a spooky night. Take care.